In this video, we're going to do a walkthrough of Query 1 from the database project. I did this in class. Apparently a number of people missed that, and so we're going to walk through that query. So if you see in the instructions towards the bottom of the screen, or in the instructions that you can download, it says that Cap, who's one of the founders of this company, is very interested in the movie studios and would like to know how many movies each of the major studios released in the year 2013. So we want a query that will give us that information. How many movies each of the major studios released in 2013? Now, the query also describes what the results are going to look like. This query should have two fields, one of them which will be called studio, which represents the studio that created the movie, and then another field called number of movies, which represents the total number of movies released by that studio in the 2013. Now, whenever I do queries, I always start with the relationships view and look at the tables and see what fields and tables I'm going to need. So in this case, we know we are going to need the studio field, and the studio field is right here in the movie table. So we know we're going to need that field. We also know, even though it's not one of the fields that we'll need in our final query, we also know that we're going to need the year that the movie was released. Not the transaction date or the return date, that has to do with when people rent the movies. But the year over here represents when the movie was released by the studio. So we know we're going to need that field. And then we may need another field as well, called number of movies. Now, number of movies doesn't exist in this database, so we're going to actually have to create that field using some additional fields that are here. But at the moment, it looks like we can get all of the information we need from this movie table. We won't need any other tables. In some queries, you'll need to add additional tables. So let's create our query using the query designer, and we will bring in the movie table. Now, like I said, we know we're going to need studio, and we know we're going to need year. As we create our query, I always like to run it periodically and see if, as I'm designing the query, if it's doing what I'm asking it to do. So let's run this query, and we can see, oh, okay, here's the studio, and here's the year, and there's one listed for every single movie in our database. There's 409 movies in this database, and there's the studio, and there's the year. You'll notice that there's some duplicates. For example, here's Paramount in 2011, and here's Paramount in 2012. So this is closer to what we want. It lists the studio, but it also has years that we don't want. We only want 2013, and it's not giving us the total number that, for Paramount for a particular year, and Lionsgate and Open Road and Warner Brothers, etc. It's giving us the year for each. So we have some work to do. The first thing that we want to do is we want to limit our values to just the year 2013. If we want to limit the number of things in a particular that a query returns, what we do is we add criteria. Criteria remove results that are the ones that we don't want from a query. So whenever we're trying to have fewer records, we use criteria to just select the results that we want. And so what we'll do here is in the year column, so this represents the year, this represents the studio. So in the year column, there is a criteria row. You can see right here, there's a criteria row. In that criteria row, I'm going to zoom in just so you can see it better in the video. We want to type in a criteria that will only give us the movies that were released in 2013. Now we can type in this in a few different ways, but it depends on the text, or it depends on the data type of the field. In this case, the year is actually a text data type. And so we'll need to type in 2013 as text. Access will recognize that the field is text, and it will put quotes around there for us. We zoom in, and Access has kind of automatically added those quotes because it knows that the year is text. If we run this now, after we've added our criteria, we'll see, oh, okay, look, we now have only 109 results. And these movies, in these studios, were the ones that were released in 2013. So that's exactly what we want, but we've limited it to just the results we want. But now we need to add up how many times, for example, Lionsgate shows up. Essentially what we want to do is look at these results, and if we were doing this manually rather than telling Access to do it automatically, we would say, okay, let's start with Lionsgate. That's the first record here. So Lionsgate appears once in these results. We'll count that as 1. Oh, here's Lionsgate again. We'll count that as 2. Scroll down here. Okay, here's Lionsgate. We'll count that as number 3. Here's Lionsgate again. There's 4, and there's 5, and then there's 6, and then down at the bottom here there's 7, and then we would keep scrolling down, and we would count up the number of Lionsgate movies that were released in that year and spit out just that number. So in order to do math down the column, okay, so we're counting down the column, in order to do that kind of math, we need to add what's called an aggregate function. And I talked about this in some of the other queries, but for this aggregate function, we need to decide which one we want. In order to access the aggregate functions, we have to hit this big capital sigma button that says totals under it. By selecting that, and it's now highlighted, we add this additional row down here in our query designer. And by default, this total row starts out as grouping, or as to do group by. What that means is that it will put the results, kind of group them together. In case there are duplicates, it will remove the duplicates and kind of group them into one record. Oftentimes we want that behavior, but we don't always want that behavior. Now if we hit the drop down here in this totals row, there are a number of different aggregate functions, they're called, that we can use. For example, we can use the sum function, which not surprisingly adds numbers up. We can use the average function, which averages the numbers. Minimum and maximum finds the lowest and largest number respectively. The count function goes down record by record and counts where things match up. And then there's also standard deviation and variance and first and last. We won't use those in this project. We will use the where function, and you'll see that in for example, video number 8 talks about why we would want to use where. We don't need it in this query. Occasionally, if you use, for example, the sum or average function, Access will change things around and change your totals row to expression. That's actually okay as long as it's giving you the behavior that you want, but we won't use it expressly in this project. So the question now is, which of those aggregate functions do we want? Well, let's look at our data one more time. You'll notice that we've gotten rid of some of our duplicates here, so we're down to 21 records, corresponding to the 21 studios that released in 2013, but we still don't know how many movies Lionsgate released. Well, so what do we want to do from our previous query if we weren't grouping these together? Well, do we want to add things up? Do we want to add up Lionsgate plus Lionsgate plus Lionsgate plus Lionsgate? Well, no, that doesn't make sense to add text together. How about do we want to add 2013 plus 2013 plus 2013? Well, that doesn't give us the number of movies that were released. So neither of those functions is really, the sum function is really not helpful. Well, how about average? No, that doesn't really give us the total number of movies released that year. Minimum and maximum also don't give that. The function we want in this case is actually the count function. And so it will do, the count function does exactly what we did manually a minute ago, is it goes down, and every time you see Lionsgate, it will count that as 1, and it will go and count up the number of times Lionsgate shows up in that column. So that's exactly what we want. But as I've told many people in class, the count function is, you've got to be careful with the count function. I recommend whenever you use the count function, if possible, it's not always possible, but if possible, try to count a field that cannot be blank, or else the count function might give you incorrect results. Up here, we have only one field that cannot be blank. Primary key fields cannot be blank. All right, it's part of their properties. Like they're not allowed to be blank. You will get an error if you try to put a blank value in a primary key. And so I'm going to use the movie ID field. It actually would have been fine if we used some of these other fields because they're not blank in this particular database. But I'm going to just to show you the right way to do it, I'm going to use the movie ID field to count. Now occasionally, like there's one query in this project, you have to count, but you can't use a primary key, and that's okay. But normally we want to try to use a field that can't be blank. So I'm going to add the movie ID field down here, and then change the total row to count. Let's see what happens. So if we run this query, Access has done a couple of things for us. One, it's now counted up things, and so now we can see, oh, okay, Lionsgate Studio released 13 movies in the year 2013. Well, that's pretty great. That's the number we want. That's the information we're looking for. But it's also done some interesting things, okay, because it's changed the name of the field that it returns to be count of movie ID. Well, that's weird. That's not exactly what we want. And it's also not what it's not what we have down here. It's movie ID, but Access, whenever we add aggregate functions, it kind of changes the name around for us. Well, in our instructions, it says we want number of movies, not count of movie ID. Well, this is the right values that we're returning, okay? So we've got the right answers so far for each of these rows. But we want to change the name of count of movie ID, and we'll have to do this throughout the project. Whenever we want to do that, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to zoom in again so you can see this. You don't have to zoom when you're doing your project. Here's what we do. We want to count up movie ID field. We still want to do that. But we want to change the name of this field. We'll put our cursor at the beginning, and then we will type in whatever the new name of this field is supposed to be. So in this case, it's going to be number of, with capital, movies. And then we will put the colon character, which is the shift semicolon. Now be very careful when you're typing in the new names of fields that they are exactly like the instructions say, including being case sensitive. Don't make this lowercase, don't put spaces in between here, type them exactly as show up right here in the bold letters. If you don't, the grader might grade it as incorrect. So now what we've done is we've told Access, use the movie ID field from this table up here, because it found movie ID up here in this table, apply the count aggregate function to it, but then when you display the results, rename that field or that column to be the number of movies, all right? That's all we're telling Access to do. And so now when we run this query, we get the exact same results as we had before, but this column, this field, is now called number of movies. Now this is pretty close to being a correct answer, and I do give partial credit, the grader does do partial credit, but we're not quite done. So let's check out the instructions and make sure that we've got everything correct. So the very first thing is we need to create a query that lists two fields. Uh-oh, we actually have three fields listed here: studio, year, and number of movies. So we need to get rid of one of those fields. So which ones are we supposed to display? Well, we're supposed to display studio and number of movies. So this year field is extra. We don't need it anymore. The question then becomes, can we just highlight this and delete it? Well, the answer is no, because we need this criteria here. We need to limit our results to those that are only found in the year 2013. And so we have to have this field in here, but we don't want to show the field. So in this query, we can simply uncheck that box and it will be just fine. And we don't show that field, and yet the results are still the same. Sometimes though, that won't work for us. In other queries, you'll notice that it won't work. So for example, if we had multiple years here, we wouldn't be able to do that. And so as a general rule, whenever we don't want a field to show up in an aggregate, in a query where the totals rows on, where we're using an aggregate function like count, we want to change the grouping from group by to where. Now, like I said, in this query, it doesn't matter whether you change this to where or whether you leave it as group by and then uncheck this show box. Either result will be the same. But in other queries, that won't be the case, so be careful of that. Now, we also should check and say, okay, the instructions say we need to sort this list in descending order by number of movies. Okay, we haven't done that yet. Okay, this is not sorted at all. Well, it's sorted by the studio, but it's not sorted at all by number of movies. So we'll go and notice that there's a sort row. We'll change this to be descending order, run it again, and now we're displaying our results descending order by the number of movies. Now, one cool thing about this project is I have given you, if I can find it, I've given you a checklist at the very end. So let me scroll over to the very end, and here's our project checklist. So query 1, check. Should it return? This needs to return. Let me push this down so we can navigate. This needs to return 2 fields. All right, studio and number of movies. Good, 2 fields. It needs to return 21 records. There's 21 records. And record 2 should be the studio Lionsgate. Here's record 2 and Lionsgate. And there's query 1, all finished.